There is a photograph that stopped the world, a man crossing a finish line alone in the dark, feet bare against ancient Roman stone, arms open as if receiving something the rest of humanity had not yet understood. Nobody had sent him. Nobody had expected him. In a world that had already decided who the great champions were, where they came from, what they wore, and what flags they carried, one man from the Ethiopian highlands walked onto the Olympic stage and erased every assumption in a single night. To understand how that moment was possible, you have to go back to a place of thin air and red earth, to a highland village in Ethiopia where a boy grew up running not for medals but simply because the land demanded it. He was born in August of 1932 in Jato, a small village in the men's district of central Ethiopia, the seventh of 10 children in a family of subsistence farmers who lived at an altitude that would leave most athletes gasping. At that altitude, nearly 10,000 feet above sea level, every breath builds the kind of lung capacity that no training program in Europe or America could manufacture. His body was being shaped by geography long before any coach ever saw him. But childhood in men's was not an idyll. It was hard labor, thin food, and survival, and the boy who would one day make history spent his early years herding cattle across steep hillsides with no shoes and no thought of anything beyond the next horizon. At the age of 17, following a path that many young Ethiopian men of his era took, he traveled to Addis Ababa and enlisted in the Imperial Bodyguard, the elite military force responsible for protecting Emperor Haile Selassie. The Imperial Bodyguard was more than a military unit. It was a world of discipline, hierarchy, and fierce competition, and it was inside those compound walls that a Swedish officer named Ani Niskanen first noticed something unusual about a young guardsman who ran as if the ground cost him nothing. Niskanen was an athletic coach assigned to Ethiopia by the Swedish Red Cross, and when he watched this guardsman train, he understood something profound. The man had never been coached, never run a real race, and yet his natural form was as close to perfect as anything Niskanen had ever seen. If you have found this story, it means you are someone who looks beyond the headlines, and if you want more untold stories like this one, stories that history almost swallowed, follow Football Untold right now because there are dozens more waiting for you. Training began in earnest, but the obstacles were enormous. Ethiopia had no running tradition at the Olympic level, no infrastructure, no funding, and when the 1960 Rome Olympics approached, the nation could only afford to send a small delegation with almost no resources. The marathon slot almost went to someone else. He was the second choice, a last-minute entry into the most grueling event in Olympic athletics, and when he arrived in Rome he discovered that all the running shoes in his size had already been claimed. He made a decision that would become one of the most iconic choices in sporting history. He would run barefoot, as he had always run across the highlands of Ethiopia, and he would simply be himself. On the night of the 10th of September, 1960, the marathon began at the Arch of Constantine, 9 in the evening, the city lit by torchlight, 18,000 soldiers of the Italian army lining the route through the ancient Roman streets. From the very first mile he moved differently from everyone else, barefoot on Roman stone, utterly composed, as if he were running a familiar path home rather than the most competitive marathon in the history of the Games. By the halfway point he had broken away from the field. By the final miles he was alone in the Roman night, the torches reflecting off the road, the crowds watching in near silence as something unprecedented moved past them. He crossed the finish line beneath the Arch of Aksum, a 2,000-year-old Ethiopian obelisk that the Italian army had taken from Ethiopia as war plunder. He finished on his own terms, beneath his own history. His time was 2 hours 15 minutes 16 seconds, a new world record. He was the first black African in history to win an Olympic gold medal, and he had done it without shoes, without precedent, and without anyone expecting it. When he returned to Addis Ababa, the emperor himself met him at the airport. Hundreds of thousands of Ethiopians lined the streets. He had become more than an athlete. He had become a symbol of what Africa could be. But what followed Rome was not rest or celebration. He trained harder than ever, because he understood that Rome was not the summit. It was the beginning, and he intended to prove that it was no accident. 4 years later in Tokyo, just 40 days before the 1964 Olympics, he was rushed to hospital with acute appendicitis and underwent emergency surgery. Doctors told him his Olympic dream was over. He told them nothing. He arrived at the Tokyo Marathon start line 40 days after abdominal surgery, stood among the greatest marathon runners in the world, and when the gun fired, he ran as if none of it had happened. He won again. 2 hours 12 minutes 11 seconds, another world record, faster than Rome despite the surgery, and this time when he crossed the finish line he stopped, sat down, and began doing stretching exercises as if he had merely been out for a morning jog. The image of him stretching at the finish line while other runners were still gasping through the final miles became one of the defining photographs of the 20th century Olympics. A portrait of a man who seemed to exist on a different plane from everyone else. He was now a giant of world athletics, feted across Europe and America, photographed by the world press, celebrated by Haile Selassie, and spoken of in the same breath as the greatest endurance athletes who had ever lived. And then, in March of 1969, everything changed. A car accident near Addis Ababa left him with a broken neck and permanent paralysis from the waist down. He was 36 years old. He would never walk again. What he did next was perhaps the most astonishing chapter of all. From his wheelchair he became a competitive archer and won gold medals at the Paralympic Games in 1970, in wheelchair racing, and refused to accept that the accident had defined him. He died on the 25th of October 1973 from a brain hemorrhage related to his accident, just 4 years after that dark road near Addis Ababa took everything from him, and yet even that cannot be the last word about his life. Emperor Haile Selassie declared a national day of mourning. Tens of thousands of Ethiopians filed past his coffin. The man who had run barefoot into history was given a state funeral that kings and heads of government received. Today his name is carried by the Abebe Bikila Stadium in Addis Ababa. His statue stands in the Ethiopian capital, and every barefoot runner who has ever crossed a finish line does so in the shadow of what he proved possible on a Roman night in 1960. He never had a sponsor, never had a shoe contract, never had a modern training facility, and he rewrote the history of human achievement twice, because the greatest stories in sport have never been about equipment or money or expectation. They have been about people who refused to be told what was impossible. If this story moved you, follow Football Untold, because the stories that history almost forgot are the ones worth telling most.